Magandang gabi po sa inyo. Ito po si Butch Valdes at si Itos kasama po natin ngayong gabi. As usual, at andito po tayo sa Ating Katipunan. As you all know, ang ating pong programa takes up many issues. Most issues have to do with economics, but also we include, kasama na rin po mga issues that are happening all over the world. Specifically, ito pong mga nangyayari ngayon sa bansang Amerika. Of course, meron tayong mga pandemic and all economies are suffering from this, no? But whatever is happening in America is something of concern, not just to us Filipinos, but to the rest of the world. Because America is the biggest market still in the world, and what is happening there as far as the COVID thing, and more especially sa economics, no, is of a specific concern to us, no. Kasi po sabi nga nila, pag nabahing ang Amerikano, no, ang Amerika, lahat ng buong mundo ay nagkakasakit, no. In a way, kailangan maintindihan po natin dito. One of the biggest economies in the world, if not the biggest, is still the United States. Sila yung biggest importer of goods kasi mataas ang kanilang level of consumption, no? At siya na rin ang pinaka malaking export destiny ng Chinese goods, no? Because ang two big markets of China goods will be the United States and Europe, no? At nakikita nyo na pag bumagsak ang ekonomiya ng Europe at ng bansang Amerika, mas kokonti ang kakayanin nilang i-import from China, because right now China naman is the biggest producer of goods in the world, no? At pag nabawasan ang importation ng Amerika from China and Europe from China, even China's economy is going to be in a very serious condition, no? Kanya that's integrated by economic situation. Tayo kasama na diyan, no? Pero ang pagsama natin dito hindi naman malaking we're not a big market for China. Ang talagang malaking market ito. Kanya pag bumagsak ang Europe, bumagsak ang Amerika, no? Problema. Pag nagka-problema mga bansa na ganitong kalalaki, ang nakakatakot po yung tinatawag na political situation. Aabot po yan sa political situation at katulad ngayon, meron ng tension, no, sa mga iba-ibang lugar. May tension sa bansang Russia, itong Belarus, nagkakaroon sila ng parang revolution. Yung Belarus ay karatig bayan lang ng bansang Russia. At ang sinasabi ng iba, ang may kagagawan daw dito sa unrest dito sa Belarus ay CIA. Walang pinagkaiba yan doon sa ginawa nila sa Ukraine. Gumawa silang parang revolution doon, napalitan nila yung kanilang presidente na sumusuporta sa kaibigan ng Russia, no? At ang pinasok nila ang political groups that are anti-Russia. Tandaan niyo po, ito ay karatig bansa lang ng Russia. So nagkakaroon sila ngayon ng kakayanan maglagay ng missile base dito sa border ng Russia, nakatutok sa Kremlin, dito naman sa China, maraming mga so-called military exercises going on as we speak. Wala pong tigil ang military exercises na yan dito po sa China Sea. Habang dumalayag ang mga warships ng Amerikano tsaka lumilipad-lipad, nagpa-practice daw ang mga eroplano nila landing and take off sa mga aircraft carriers dito po sa China Sea, no? Kuminsan daw ay lumalapit na sa bansang China. Exercises lang yan. So ang bansang China naman, yung kanilang Navy, linalabas din nila, nag-exercises din sila. So para bagang maski natawag nila exercise, parang nag-uumpisa na po ang duruan. Now this is happening in a condition of politics in the United States, where the coming November is going to be an election period, election time. And as you know, itong si Presidente Trump, buhat nung nahalal siya. 4 years ago, 2016, nahalal siya ng a few months after President Duterte. The opposition started hammering on him already kung ano-anong pinaparatang sa kanya. At ang sabi, mayroon siyang connection sa Russia at yung mga Russia binigyan siya ng intelligence information laban naman sa Democrats. At lahat ito puro paratang at hindi po nanaig sa kanilang mga paratang dahil mali-mali ang mga ebidensya, wala silang ebidensya, and puro po fake news ang lumalabas. Ngayon po, lumalabas na yan at iniisa-isa na ng mga ahensya ng gobyerno itong mga tiwali na nagbibigay nito. Pagkatapos, hindi pa natapos yung paratang tungkol sa Russia, they started moving for his impeachment. Again, in the same vein, they moved for their impeachment, for the presidential impeachment of the president using all kinds of fake news, no? And since in the United States, ang majority ng mababang kapulungan are the Democrats. Kaya malakas ang loob nila dun sa impeachment na may mapapa-impeach nila dito sa mababang kapulungan. Katulad po dito sa atin, ang impeachment move starts from lower house, no? And they move once they decide that he should be impeached, it's already brought to the Senate, who will act like the judge, no? Ganito din ang nangyayari sa atin. Tandaan niyo po yung nangyari kay Erap, hindi ba ba?
Corona na, di ba?
Sino Corona?
Justice Corona.
Yeah, pero not as president, no? So, ang mangyayari po dito, itong si Trump pumunta sa Senate, at dito naman sa Senate, kala nila may mga senador na sasang-ayon sa mga Democrats, hindi po nangyari yun, no? At na-acquit etong si President Trump, no? Ngayon, ano na naman ang nangyayari? Etong siyempre, minalas po ang buong mundo, tinamaan ng COVID, no? When you get hit by COVID, talagang you just have to make do with everything you can, no? But it seems, kung titingnan nyo yung statistika ng buong mundo, the biggest, the largest casualties, no? In terms of deaths, in terms of cases, is the United States of America. Mind you, this is the most powerful, most developed country in the world, no? And yet, it is statistically, again, say statistically, it has the biggest share of COVID deaths. It's a little mind-boggling, no? Iisipin mo, being the most advanced, being the most powerful, being the most developed, pagdating sa healthcare, pagdating dyan. Bakit sila ang tinatamaan ng pinakamalaki? Dapat nga yung mga ibang bansa na hindi nakahanda at walang kakayanan in terms of ratio, in terms of tawag dito yung ano tayo, prorated, no? Dapat malalaki, katulad po ng Pilipinas, no? Bakit ang sa atin nandito, pero yung sa bansang Amerika nandun? Hindi mo naman sasabihin mas magaling yung mga tao dito sa Pilipinas. Dahil tingnan mo na lang si Department of Health Secretary, no? Si Duque. Libo-libo, ano na, ilang daan libo na ang gustong maparesign niya, no? Halos ang buong Senado gusto siyang paresign. Halos lahat ng mga kongresista gusto siyang paresign. Hindi po natin alam kung bakit siyang anong misteryo ang nangyayari between Duterte and Duque. But without digressing, I'm just saying that these are the things that are happening. Dahil po siguro ang mga kalaban ni President Trump sa Amerika ay talagang gusto siyang ibagsak buhat noon. Hindi nila na plano, hindi nila expect that President Trump was going to win the election because this guy was not a politician. He had no network. He had no financing coming from George Soros and all of that sort of thing. But we could see that the people in the United States did not want to go again with the system that was being pushed to them by the Democrats, especially sila Barack Obama, sila Clinton, at lahat-lahat. And nagsalita ang taong bayan. So naging presidente po si President Trump. No? Ngayon, ayaw nilang maulit ito at gumagawa na sila ng lahat ng paraan para hindi pumasok si Trump. Bakit po nila ayaw talaga si Trump? Marami namang ginagawang tama si Trump. No? At hindi masyadong nalalaman ng tao, di ba, itos, no? And what does he do? If you listen to many of his speeches, and which is not by the way available in CNN, no? Kasi mga mainstream media kalaban siya. At kung doon lang tayo tututok sa mainstream media, ay malilin lang tayo, no? And others go all the way up to mga YouTube, no, to get the full speeches of President Trump. At makikita nyo po kung ano ang mga sinasabi nitong taong to. Hindi po siya taong gustong manggera sa buong mundo. He is not someone you might call a war hawk that is ready to go into a nuclear war with Russia, with China, with North Korea, or anyone. As a matter of fact, he is doing everything he can to avoid war. But at the same time, he's doing everything he can to improve the economic situation of the United States so that they will again become the producer, the greatest producer nation of the whole world in the way they were before. Ngayon, hindi na po silang biggest producer. China na po ang biggest producer. Paano nangyari ito? Kasi ang sinasabi niya, yung mga nakaraan administrasyon, katulad nitong kay Barack Obama at pati na rin yung bago kay Barack Obama, sila George Bush, no? Ay gumawa ng mga paraan para bumagsak ang kakayanan ng bansang Amerika maging producer nation. No? And because of that, nawawalan ng trabaho mga tao sa Amerika at naging problema sa kanilang ekonomiya ito. Now, he's trying to get this back. Can you imagine the biggest producer nation before, the biggest industrialized country before, is now has to import its vaccines and its medicines from other countries. No? And so he's doing everything he can to bring back the production of medicine, including vaccines, in the United States. Because he's an American and this is his commitment to the people of the United States. Now, if he is intending to expand world peace, to push world peace, if he is intending to create the conditions so that America becomes now a producer nation, why are the opposition political parties against this? Yung tinatawag natin deep state. Yung deep state po, naging usual term, yung deep state dahil po sa sila po ang parang nagmamaniobra sa ilalim ng halal na gobyerno, no, para magawa ang kanilang kagustuhan. Ngayon, sino-sino mo ito? Meron pong mga miyembro sa CIA, sa FBI, sa Kongreso, sa State Department, sa mga yan. Pero hindi sila lumilitaw. At kasama na din nila ang mga miyembro sa mga Wall Street, mga financials, mga Federal Reserve, mga bangko, kasama na nila dyan. Dahil meron silang ibang direksyon ang gusto. Karamihan po ngayon ng nasa deep state ay taliwas dito sa ginagawa ni Trump na mag-promote ng world peace. Ang gusto nitong mga deep state, yung mga manatili ang kanilang intensyon. Pag kalaban ka, we will change your government or we will take over your government. At if we have to go to war with you to do that, we will. Ganyan po ang isip nitong mga nasa deep state. Pero sa umpisa pa lang, sa kampanya at umpisa pa lang ng administration ni President Trump, nangako na siya sa bansang Amerika at sa buong mundo that during his term, there will be no regime change. Regime change. Yan pong term na yan, no, has been used because it became almost a matter of fact that the CIA and other agencies intervene and insinuate themselves in different governments, imposing themselves for these governments to follow them, or the leaders will be changed. Yan yung regime change. Kasama po dyan sa mga yan, sa CIA, pati na rin itong mga George Soros, itong mga financiers, itong mga pumupondo ng International Court of Justice, tsaka yung mga pumupondo, si George Soros, siya pumupondo ng ICJ, siya pumupondo ng arbitration courts, ganyan, no? Bakit? Wala man connection yan sa mga United Nations, pero yun ang pinupondohan nila. So, I just wanted to give you a little background of partly what I see, what we see in our discussions, in our studies. At the same time, it becomes also our personal opinion aside from the others. Well, because what we show to you here, of course, you don't have to take as gospel truth. It is an opinion that we derive from how we see things developing around the world. No? At kanya po kami interesado dito kasi po wala pong mangyayari sa ating mga plano kung paano natin gustong i-direct ang ating pong bansa kung magkaroon ng malawakang giyera. At marami na pong nagsasabi, napakalapit na po natin dito sa isang malawakang gera, a world war, no? Which can start even as we speak by just a mistake, no? By some military elements, no? Dito sa mga sa atin dito sa China Sea. Pag nagkamali ang isang fighter pilot dyan o isang nakatulog na natamaan niya ang isang raketa at biglang lumipad papunta sa China, wala na tayong magagawa po noon. Siguradong babalikan na ng China at tuloy-tuloy ng gera. At wala na tayong panahon sasabihin, tayo muna, time out. Yan po ang pwedeng mangyari. And tonight, we decided to invite our good friend, a guy who has made a lot of friends here in the Philippines. His name is Mike Billington. And as soon as he is available, we will be bringing him in a Zoom meeting. I also invited our good friends also here, sila Toti, Casiño, at saka sila RJ to join us dito sa Zoom meeting with Mike Billington. No? Andyan na ba si Roxanne?
Yes.
Andyan na siya?
Yes po.
Pwede mo na siyang i-on. There you go. Okay. Can you see us, Mike? Okay, I've got Itos here, and
Hello.
you're looking well, Mike. Huh?
You?
You must have slept well last night. I also invited our good friends from KDP, Toti Casiño and RJ Javellana, who are our co-hosts in the different programs here. Yeah. And,
What was the first person?
his name is Toti Casiño, Toti. That's his nickname, Toti Casiño, and Casino, no? And Enye actually, No. And then the other guy is RJ
Yeah, got it.
Javellana, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just was giving a little brief on the background of what's happening, and
Are you on the air now?
yes, we are.
Okay.
Yeah, and you might want to say hello to all of your friends in the Philippines and all over the world. By the way, this is being broadcast all over the world, no? Including the United States.
I'm very glad to be on, and I welcome you all, but you're going to have to give me a moment to go get a cup of coffee before I can start.
Okay.
So you'll give me another 5 minutes. Okay?
Yeah, sure. Okay, go get your cup of coffee. No, we have all the time.
And feed the cats.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so yan po si kaibigan natin si Mike Billington. We've known each other for the past, how long na Itas? 20 years? Huh? About,
More.
maybe a little bit more than 20 years, no? Kasama na po natin si Mike Billington at ang una pong pumunta dito noon ay yung kanyang his wife na si Gail Billington, una natin nakilala noon. At ang malapit nung kay Gail, pati na nung pumunta siya sa Amerika, si Itos, no? At napakatalino din po, kinalang nagkaroon po siya ng karamdaman at she passed away some years ago. No? So si Mike is a widower. in the process over the years, Mike has been visiting the Philippines maybe I don't know 4 or 5 times now. So ganyan po ang ano. At tinatabayanan din po natin yung kaibigan natin sila Toti at si RJ. Kung andyan na sila, ipasok na natin. Kayo pong mga nanonood, in case you've got questions or you want to join us, no, mag-request lang po kayo at we will try our best so that hindi na ano yung usapan, we'll try our best to get you in and you can ask your questions if you want, no? Because this show is interactive and Zoom, no? And marami po, like the other night po, kausap na po natin yung mga ibang kaibigan natin from France, from Canada, from Japan, sabay-sabay po yan. At even from Cebu, sabay-sabay po nag-Zoom meeting tayo at nakita nyo naman po sa ating mga programa sa Talakayang Bayan. Ngayon po ang programa natin ang Ating Katipunan. Nandiyan na po yung isang kasama natin, si RJ. Bumati ka naman sa mga tagahanga mo, RJ.
Good evening, Professor Butch and Itos, and also to our speaker for tonight, our guest for tonight, Mike Billington.
Pumunta lang siya, kumuha ng kape. Nagkumustahan lang kami. Hindi niya alam, on the air na pala. Pero nagpaumanin siya, kinukuha niya yung kape niya, baka masunog. No? So, kunin niya. So, anyway, is Toti there already? Wala pa?
Wala pa.
Okay. At any rate, ang pinag-usapan natin, a few minutes to start, binigyan ko ng konting briefing ang mga tagapanood natin tungkol dito sa Amerika at ang sitwasyon sa ating paningin, no? At mas mabuti na rin at may makakausap tayo ngayon katulad ni Mike Billington na maraming nalalaman dito sa sitwasyon sa bansang Amerika at ang magiging problema hindi lang po ng bansang Amerika kundi ng buong mundo kung yung mga nararapat mangyari o nararapat gawin ng mga liderato ng mundo ay hindi matupad, no? In other words, the situation is critical, but there is a solution, no? And this is what we want to discuss with Mike Billington. Kung meron kang ibang naiisip itanong, syempre, RJ, anytime you can always intervene, no? Ikaw din, Itos, you might want to discuss certain things, no? Especially with regard to history. Kasi kaninang nag-uusap kami ni Itos, sabi namin, itong si Trump, maski na hindi niya minimension si Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ang dami niyang ginagawang hakbang na akma dito sa ginawa dati ni Roosevelt sa pagsasalba ng ekonomiya ng Amerika. Kasi nung ekonomiya ng Amerika noong 1933 ay nasa Great Depression. Ang Great Depression po, halos at that time 52% unemployment rate ang bansang Amerika. Bagsak na bagsak. At marami pong nagugutom at namamatay sa kalye noon. At ito yung panahon na pagpasok ni Franklin Roosevelt bilang presidente ng Amerika. And in a short while, nabaligtad niya yung sitwasyon from being 52% unemployment rate in a matter of 2 terms, bali 8 years, no? US became the greatest producer nation in the world. At nasabayan niya ang lakas ng Germany noon, no? na ang namumuno na nun, papasok na ay si Hitler. Kanya po ganyan ang nangyari sa atin. At kung sabi nga nung iba at that time, sabi ni LaRouche, paano mo malaman talagang paano ang Amerika no? Sinabi niya, kung titignan mo sa uniforme na lang, no? Yung mga sundalo ng Germany, no? Ang ganda-ganda ng kanilang mga uniforme. Makikita mo sila, ang kanilang uniforme parang mataas ang budget, no? Pati na yung kanilang mga tangke. Ano nang tawag doon sa tangke ng Germany na napakalaki, tsaka talong-talo yun sa Amerikano? Sherman ba yun?
Sherman? No, Sherman is American.
Panzer
Division?
Oh, parang ganyan. Na nung unang sagupaan nila, tumatalsik yung mga tangke ng Amerikano. Pero ang nagawa ng Amerikano, mass production. No? Pati makikita mo daw yung mga sundalo ng Amerikano, hindi sputing, rugged na rugged daw. At nakikita po natin, maski na sa mga sine, dahil they wanted to be realistic, nakikita mo yung diferensya ng ano. But thank God, this guy Roosevelt was able to do something and put the United States in such a situation that it was able to help the rest of the world stop the expansion of Hitler together with the oligarchs that were behind him to push an economic system which was not good for the whole world. No? At yun po ang ginawa nitong si Roosevelt. Now, dito naman kay Trump, I don't know, maybe later on we can ask Mike Billington for the details. Andiyan na ba si Mike?
Yes.
Ha?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I muted? Butch?
Okay, Mike, you're on now. You're on the broadcast, and the rest of the world is watching you. At least those that are. We have quite a few that are watching us in our programs. So you might want to greet them first, Mike.
Okay, good. And good to meet you, RJ.
Hi, good evening.
Yes, and it's been a long time since I've spoken with your
Hindi malalagay.
friends, Butch.
Yes.
But I'm certainly delighted to be here. This is certainly one of the most dangerous, but also the most potentially opportunistic moments in at least our lifetimes, at least since World War II. We're facing the greatest global crisis that mankind has had to face, in our lifetime, perhaps even longer. So I'm very glad to be here at this moment.
All right.
This crisis reaching a turning point. Do you want me to go ahead with the?
Well, I'll just give you just to get it started, Mike. I was just initially talking about President Trump, no? And probably a similar situation that he is into a great respect to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to face when he entered as president in 1933, because it was the Great Depression, and the economic situation right now of the U.S. is, of course, not in the best situation, and we're facing a similar situation. And there are certain things that we know that Roosevelt had done that seems to be the same kind of approach that President Trump is doing right now for the United States. That's where we start off, and the rest, of course, I'd like you to be able to develop it for us to get an understanding of the importance of the United States, President Trump, for the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, what we're looking at today is clearly a global crisis, which can only be addressed as a global crisis. I mean, we have the threat of war in Iran, the threat of a war with China, the threat of a war with Russia. We have the greatest pandemic. Looks like it's going to be even worse than the pandemic a century ago with Spanish flu in terms of the potential for millions of deaths once it sweeps through Africa and South America. A breakdown in the global food supply chain. So much that the head of the World Food Program has warned that we could face 300,000 deaths per day.
Wow.
Mostly from starvation, but from a combination of starvation and the pandemic, with the locusts destroying huge amounts of crops. You might have seen that even here in the United States, Iowa, which is one of the greatest food producing regions in the entire world, was devastated last weekend by, I forget the name they have for it. It's not a hurricane, but it's a kind of storm which wiped out between a third and a half of the entire Iowa crop and all of their storage bins, like what happened with the explosion in Beirut. And we have, as I'm sure your audience knows, Butch and Itos, we're in the midst of a global economic collapse, which is sparked by the pandemic, but which is not caused by the pandemic. In fact, the pandemic is not even caused by the COVID virus. The pandemic is caused by 30 years of deindustrialization, the systematic takedown of healthcare capacity around the world as dictated by policies coming from the IMF and the World Bank, and the British-style deindustrialization, austerity, maintain the financial institutions at the expense of the physical economy. So all of this has come together in a crisis in which anybody who thinks they can resolve their crisis within their country or their region is dreaming. There's nothing short of a global mobilization of the sort that Mr. LaRouche called for after the 2008 financial breakdown crisis. When that happened in 2008, LaRouche said, no one nation can resolve this crisis on its own, period. We must have at least the leading powers of the world. And he named especially the US, Russia, and China, but he also included India, which at this point may not be possible. But Russia, China, and the United States absolutely to come together to address the multiple crises we have. But in particular, we have to replace this bankrupt global financial system. And as your listeners know, that global financial system began to unravel in 1971. Yesterday was the anniversary, August 15th, 1971, when Nixon pulled the plug, as the headline of our newspaper called it. Pulled the plug on the dollar and pulled the plug on the system that Franklin Roosevelt put in place, centered on the Bretton Woods agreements, and in particular on the idea that we would not allow the British banks to use money as a commodity. We would not allow money to be gambled on, the value of money. And Roosevelt set up a fixed exchange rate system where nations could change the values of their currency if necessary, but gamblers could not come in and speculate on a currency in order to make money the way George Soros and his friends did in the late 1990s when they basically looted Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. That system was taken down in 1971. And in terms of the Rooseveltian policy, I think it's extremely important to point out that in 1971, LaRouche warned immediately when that happened, when the dollar was taken off of gold and the floating exchange rates began, he said that this will lead to a global depression and the threat of another global war. Because if you purposely take down the productive capacity of nations, if you undermine the basis on which people's survival depends, which is the productivity of your nation and the productivity of labor that comes from constantly investing in new technology, new infrastructure, when you take that down, you are facing a potential and almost certain disaster. And one of the most interesting parts of what LaRouche said then was that this will cause pandemics. 1971, he said this, taking down our financial system and turning it into a gambling system instead of an investment in production and science system will cause pandemics. And this is very important to people to recognize. It's not the coronavirus that has caused this pandemic. If nations had not had their health capacity systematically taken down, then we would have been able to deal with this coronavirus the way the Chinese did. Isolate it, cut it off, and basically it's over. Now we have in the United States today more deaths per week than the Chinese had through the entire coronavirus crisis. We have 5,000 to 6,000 deaths every single week now in the US. And of course, what we're facing in Africa and South America is a dark age, a true dark age. So we have this crisis, but I will say that we have one big advantage, which is that everybody knows that this is a massive crisis. Normal times people think, oh, you know, you guys are talking about we need a new world financial system, we need to bring people together to bring about space development, nuclear power, but you know, we're okay, we're all right, we'll get by the way we are. Nobody thinks that anymore. You know, the world is aware that civilization is in an unprecedented crisis. And this is something that is an opportunity. You probably know the Chinese always say that a great crisis is also a great opportunity. And this is indeed such an opportunity. So the greatest danger, and the thing I'd like to discuss with you and your associates right now is the danger of war with China. We have a situation in which this President Trump, was elected because he said, we must end these regime change wars. America is not a British Empire. We don't do colonial wars. We don't go out and conquer nations in order to seize their resources. We're going to end the endless wars, Donald Trump said. And he said it's a good thing to be friends with Russia. Not a bad thing, it's a good thing. We should be friends with Russia and work together to defeat terrorism, to build the nation. And as soon as he became president, he made close friends with China and with Xi Jinping, declared Xi Jinping to be a great leader of his nation, which he is. He respected that China believed in its sovereignty. He didn't blame China for the horrendous trade deficit. He said, I blame Bush and Obama for the horrendous trade deficit because we shut down our productive economy. We turned our economy away from American system principles, Hamiltonian principles, where the purpose of credit is to build up the productive power of labor. That was the American system. That when our Constitution said the pursuit of happiness, what we meant was creating the capacity for every single person to be part of a growing and expanding economy, to find a place where they can use their talents to advance the nation as a whole, right? That idea was taken down on August 15th, 1971, and instead we adopted the British system, which said, find the way for each and every person to make the greatest profit possible So our entrepreneurs, our business people said, well, we can get cheap labor in Mexico. We can get cheap labor in China. So we don't care about our citizens. We don't care if we're using new technologies to produce things better. We're just going to find the cheapest way to produce and make a lot of money quick. And what happened to infrastructure? Well, you know, the basis on which America freed itself from the British was Alexander Hamilton's committed to what they called internal improvements, what we call infrastructure. Because he knew that was by building the power, the water, the transportation, the hospitals, the educational facilities, that you lift the productivity of every single person in that economy. In fact, every person in the world, by expanding infrastructure in science and technology. But on August 15, 1971, that was eliminated. The gamblers took over not only the banking system, but increasingly took over Washington. And we ended up with a decayed economy, the collapse of our infrastructure, the flight of our industries overseas, right? So Trump knew that, and he appealed to the American people to end this era of imperialism. He didn't call it that, but we knew it to be the remnants of the old British Empire that had taken over and were turning America into a seeker of quick profit rather than long-term development and growth. And what was the line from the IMF and the World Bank? You know it well in the Philippines. Oh, I know you need infrastructure, but we leave that to the private sector. So the IMF and the World Bank, well, we used to build some infrastructure. That, of course, was Roosevelt's intention for the IMF. Right? But we don't anymore because we now realize that it's better to leave infrastructure to the private sector. Well, the private sector doesn't give a damn about it. That's long term. You don't make quick profits, right, by building a high-speed rail system. You increase the productivity of the nation, but you don't get quick profits for the person building the rail or building the bridge or building the road. Right? These are things that we knew, Hamilton and our American founding fathers knew. That was the responsibility of government. And when we ended that, when we turned to cheap labor, then we created this disaster. And Trump knew that. He said, look, it's not China's fault that we have huge trade deficit. It's Bush and Obama and the former leaders. So that's why he was elected. But what happened? He hasn't been able to do it. I know you often talk about how Duterte planned to wipe out drugs and rebuild infrastructure and work with the Chinese, and he hasn't been able to do it because of oligarchs who still have power over the economy, and that's true here. And I'm here in the United States. And in particular, you have to look at this threat of war with China in a very serious way. You all know that when Trump got the nomination to be president, all of a sudden the British and their assets in the US Congress in both parties went berserk and said, we can't have Trump. He wants to be friends with Russia. He wants to be friends with China. We can't allow that because the empire depends upon the division of the world, East versus West, freedom versus godless communism, they used to say, you know? And now all of a sudden they're talking about Communist Party in China. They don't say China anymore, it's the Communist Party in China. Well, the Communist Party in China, like many things in China, is the Chinese Communist Party with Chinese characteristics. So it's not the old communism that we used to see in the days of Mao and in the days of Stalin. It's obviously something very, very different. That China has had a restoration of the Confucian tradition of China that had been wiped out during the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And unfortunately, the so-called Gang of Four took over. Mao was pulled into this insanity of shutting down education, shutting down science and technology, driving people to go out and work with the peasants, to learn from the peasants, as if somehow this was going to save them from Western imperialism. It was a horrible mistake. A lot we could say about that. But when they got over that, they launched really the greatest economic miracle in the history of the human race. Never Even in the 1930s under Roosevelt, what we did in the United States with mass infrastructure, water, power, sanitation conditions, roads, railroads, nuclear power. We developed nuclear power under Roosevelt in the middle of the Depression in the 1930s. But the Chinese have done it on an even more massive scale. Total transformation of the country, lifting 800 million people out of poverty. They now have 35,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, beautiful bridges, ports, nuclear power facilities, a fusion research program at the front edge of the world, a space program which is now making breakthroughs even beyond what's being done in some areas of the West. That's why they don't want the United States to work with China and with Russia, because that breaks up the British Empire's divide and conquer mentality of how to control the world. And at a moment at which the entire financial system is a huge bubble, $2 quadrillion, 1,000 trillion, $2 quadrillion, twice as much in gambling debts, derivatives, than we had in 2008, ready to blow apart. They need the world divided, they need the world at war, and if it means nuclear war, we'll take the chance because we think we can force them back now. So that's what's happened. Trump does not have control over the military. The military, many of the leading military forces have openly joined with the British to run this anti-Russia campaign. And when the Russia Gates campaign, the attempt to show that Russia controlled our election and controlled Trump, when that fell apart, when it was exposed that the head of our intelligence, Clapper, and the head of the CIA, John Brennan, that these people were liars, they were lying to the Congress, they were lying to the American people, they were making up a lie about Russia interfering in the election and supporting Trump. They're now facing jail. But then what did the British do? The head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, and Christopher Steele, the author of that fake dossier about Trump's collusion with the Russians, they're now facing jail time, prison time, and that's exactly what they deserve. But when Russiagate fell apart, they launched Chinagate. And the problem with Donald Trump, as you know, is that he has been convinced, only in the last few months, only in March and April, he was convinced that he had to blame China for the coronavirus. He had to blame the economic breakdown, not on 30 years of purposeful deindustrialization, which he used to say before, but to blame it on China, on the virus. This is a big mistake by Trump. But he knows better, that we know, right? And we know that he's capable of breaking. You want to know how we know he's capable of breaking? Because every now and then he says something very truthful, like a few days ago when he said, we're going to continue with the greatest trade deal with China that we've ever had. They're buying huge amounts of our goods. This is good. Maybe they want me to think better of them. Because he'd like to be able to say, I know China's a great nation. But he's been convinced of this crazy story about China's to blame for the world crisis because he wants to win the election that way. Mistake. But you know, this is what's happening. We have to acknowledge that. The problem is that he has people like Pompeo around him, who is an absolutely insane character. This is a guy who calls himself a Christian, but he's actually a Satanist, literally a Satanist. He really believes that if people don't do what we tell them to do, what he personally tells them to do, we're going to kill them. And he means that. You know the crisis in Lebanon that's going on now. Mr. Pompeo went to Lebanon and said, either you throw the Hezbollah out of your government. We don't like your government. We don't like the government your people have chosen. Hezbollah must go, or you can go to hell. And he meant that. Because if you force that one faction out of the government, you're basically saying, have a civil war, folks. And they didn't. You know what they did instead? President Aoun, who's a Christian, and Nasrallah, who is a Hezbollah leader, got together and said, we must go with China, because China is offering to build infrastructure. Where in the West, they don't offer us anything except more debt, right? So we're going to go with China. And then all of a sudden, boom, this huge explosion in Beirut wipes out their port, wipes out 85% of their food supply. And Mr. Arun, the president, he says, we are not ruling out sabotage. We don't know yet. But the circumstances are such, we're in a moment in history in the world that you have to expect horrible things to happen because there are people who want war if they don't get their way. Now we've got to turn this around. The potential is enormous. What the Belt and Road has done, I just did a conference in Pakistan day before yesterday, where the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor has totally transformed that country. We're going to do more to use that as an example of what could be happening if we didn't have this financial oligarchy sitting on top of us in most parts of the world, including here in the United States. So it's a moment of tremendous opportunity. People know the danger. What we have fought for, I'm sure, I know you've talked about this, is like Mr. LaRouche's call for the great leaders to come together. Vladimir Putin has called for the so-called P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, to have a meeting, and all of them have agreed. Trump and Putin were on the phone for an hour and talked about that meeting, although they have not set a date as yet. But if you have that meeting, you'll have Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping. And when Trump is allowed to do his own personal diplomacy, like he started to do with China, like he was doing with North Korea, like he does with Putin, then you can break out of this oligarchy. So we are fighting to get that so-called P5 meeting. It will include Macron and Boris Johnson because the P5 includes the French and the British. That's okay. If you get Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping together, then we have every reason to believe that they can do what we're fighting for them to do, which is to bring about a new Bretton Woods system, move to get an emergency health program to stop the threat of absolute genocide in Africa, South America, and other parts of the world from the pandemic and starvation, right? And basically to stop this war drive and to bring about cooperation. So this is a tremendous potential moment in history. It's very, very dangerous, but it also has the potential for being the launching of a new paradigm for all of mankind and the end of empire, finally, once and for all. I can't hear you, Butch. Butch, I can't hear you. Are you muted?
No,
Okay, now
I'm
you're-
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. RJ is here. Ethos is also here, and we'll be asking questions. Let me ask the first one, Mike. We can see that what President Trump is trying to do is to move towards world peace rather than world war. And however, as you had explained, that there are elements that do not want this move of President Trump. It seems right now, at least from the feedback we get from the so-called mainstream media in the United States, that CNN and even Fox News to some extent, MSNBC and ABC, they are all bashing Trump. Or Fox News at least is not defending Trump as much as they should. But obviously the other mainstream media is bashing them and creating this condition of almost fomenting hate towards the man. We who are thousands of miles away don't fully understand what's going on, except only from what we see in CNN. Who are these people, and what are the means that they have to be able to do this kind of campaign against against Trump. No?
Right. In fact, as you know, they're also spawning a insurrection in the country. We have anarchists tearing down major parts of major cities all over the country. And it has nothing to do, really, almost nothing to do with the so-called racial question. This is not about Black Lives Matter. This is mostly young white kids, mostly on drugs, who have been, you can try to give a motivation for them, but you should not make the mistake of giving a justification. Motivation is that we have a generation of youth who have had their future taken away from them. This is long before Trump. You know, we had under Bush and Obama, we had permanent wars. They had nothing to look forward to except maybe joining the military and making a little money, but probably ending up dead or wounded. They had no opportunity to be part of an expanding economy because the economy was collapsing. The ideology of the banking system was the Green New Deal. And keep in mind that this green stuff about deindustrialization, shutting down production, shutting down technology, going back to the land, this comes straight from the British financial system. It's run by people like Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England, and now is the head of the Green New Deal at the United Nations, like Michael Bloomberg, who is one of these fanatic green people, who are literally arguing now that the way to force the Green New Deal is to cut off credit to any company that has a carbon footprint, i.e. any company that's productive, that produces anything useful. Shut them down by cutting off their credit. This is the kind of evil in the financial system that we're dealing with. So our children were told basically, go ahead and take drugs. Drugs are okay. We're going to legalize marijuana. We're going to legalize cocaine. And they have all over the country. We have legalized dope. And they're told this is okay. Their teachers tell them it's okay. They say, you don't want to learn science and technology. That pollutes the earth. Go back and smoke dope and help us build windmills. No. I mean, this is a back to the Stone Age mentality. And they're told, well, yeah, of course we're at war. We're always at war, right? We're the policemen of the world. We need to bring freedom and democracy to the world. Did you notice how we brought freedom and democracy to Iraq and to Libya and Syria? See, we brought freedom and democracy by funding terrorists, turning the country over to warring terrorist gangs, driving millions of people out of their homes as refugees into the rest of the Middle East and into Europe, destroying Europe along with the Middle East with these perpetual wars. So we had a whole generation who were given nothing of a future. And when you have that, then those people who are recruiting anarchy, who are recruiting to tear down, you have a very rich pool of people with whom to brainwash some mindless children and some of the really impoverished people in the Black and Hispanic community into turning them into anarchists and looters. So we have an insurrection in the country, and it's really phase 3 of the coup attempt against Donald Trump. This is anything to tear down the country. You know what a color revolution is. You've seen this kind of thing. There's one going on in Belarus right now today, like what they did in Ukraine back in 2014. Well, it's happening right here in the United States. And what you brought up, Butch, the media, and I would not be an apologist for Fox News, because Fox News is as rabid against Russia and China, especially now China, as MSNBC and CNN and so forth. This is a totally top-down British-run operation. In the UK, they call it the Integrity Initiative. They purposely set up institutions in the intelligence community whose purpose was to monitor and control the press totally. Any press which goes against the grain of saying Russia killed the Skripals, Russia invaded Ukraine, when anybody with brains knows that Barack Obama and the British ran a Nazi coup in the Ukraine in 2014. It was not just a color revolution. In the case of Ukraine, they purposely recruited the people who were working with Adolf Hitler back in the 1930s and 40s, intentionally, armed them, right, and set them loose with Molotov cocktails and guns to tear down the elected government of Ukraine, right, and impose a Nazi administration that would serve as a tool to blame Russia for everything, right? So here we have a situation in which the British control of the media, anybody who dares to say that Crimea was part of Russia throughout its entire history, until for some reason Mr. Khrushchev said, well, let's let Ukraine administer Crimea for now, for no very good reason. But now, Russia has broken the post-war era and stolen Crimea. This is a total lie. It's as big a lie as Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, which was sold to the American people by who? By the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Fox News. The media is the empire. You don't try to get into the media in order to win over the people. No, you identify the media as the enemy. This is one of the most brilliant things that Donald Trump did.
Right.
He said, it's the damn media. It's you. We go to our speeches, he'd say, you up there, the fake news, you know. And the American people know that. So one of the reasons they love Trump and elected him when nobody thought he could possibly win was because he tells the truth about the media, tells the truth about the destruction of our economy, and he tells the truth about these colonial wars, which we should not be part of. So we have to make it possible for Trump to go back to what he originally wanted to do. Now, there are signs, like I said, he said this thing about China. You might have heard just a couple of days ago. Out of the blue, he had the press in the White House with him, with some of his advisors, and he said, what about this guy Edward Snowden? No, some people tell me he's a traitor, but you know, some people think he's been terribly mistreated. What do you think? Do you think we ought to give him a pardon? What's your view? You know, there's some people say treason, some people say what do you think? So now this is very important because, of course, Snowden also exposed the fact that Clapper, the head of the intelligence, and Brennan, the head of the CIA, lied to the Congress, lied to the American people about the fact that they had set up the biggest espionage state, spy state, surveillance state in the history of the human race. Far beyond the Chinese, they blame Huawei, TikTok, WeChat. Oh, the Chinese are spying on us. Well, everybody knows that Snowden showed that the U.S. has the far superior espionage system on the American people, and in fact on every single person on Earth. The NSA spies on. So that's what Trump is thinking. Now think one step beyond that. Is he going to say the same thing about Assange? Right? Because who is Assange? Assange is one of, like Snowden, a whistleblower, right? Who told the truth to the American people. That's why he's being prosecuted. That's why Snowden is called a traitor. Because Snowden told the truth to the American people, which the media didn't want the American people to know, the British didn't want the American people to know, the Congress didn't want the American people to know, right? That's what Snowden did. And what did Assange do? Assange showed, by releasing the emails of the Democrat Party, that the Democrat Party was breaking its own rules because they wanted Hillary Clinton to be the candidate, not Bernie Sanders. Now, I have no admiration for Bernie Sanders in the least, but Hillary Clinton was the spokesman for the war party, like Obama, like George Bush. People who brought us the wars, who brought us the Green New Deal, who brought us the legalized drugs, and so on and so forth. So that's what Assange revealed, the truth. Oh, well, he revealed the truth to the American people. That's a crime. We have to get him. So now they're trying to kill him in a British prison. Assange is very, and I think you've talked to Mr. Binney. Have you had Binney on your program, Bush?
No. Well, we watched the interview of Mr. Bini on YouTube, but we didn't have him on the program.
Okay, maybe we can arrange that.
Yeah.
Use-
Yeah, Mike.
You know, I think people know Vinny, who was the person at the National Security Agency who designed the program that Snowden revealed. But he designed it to catch terrorists, not to be a spy operation against every single human being. And he built in protective policies that made it impossible for the NSA or the CIA to go after individuals that they wanted to target. Right? So when he found out that the NSA had taken down those protections and was using his system to spy on every single human being, even Angela Merkel, you know, they were listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone. I mean, this was how extensive this was. When he found that out, he quit. They tried to put him in jail, by the way they did Mr. LaRouche and myself and others. But because he was revealing things in his own head, not stealing anything, they were unable to do that. But he has exposed now, as you saw in the interview, that the Russians did not steal those Democrat emails. Quite the opposite. It was done by somebody on the inside who wanted to expose the truth, who downloaded those emails and gave it to Assange. So maybe Trump will pardon Snowden, and maybe he'll pardon Assange, and that will help Trump because these are the people who can prove that the entire case against Trump with the Russiagate was a lie. Now, what's very important to understand is that when Russiagate failed, it's exactly the same British assets. Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, Christopher Steele and his company Orbis, who said, okay, now we go after China. Now it's difficult for the American people to get this, because in their mind, they've been convinced that Trump is against China. But in fact, the people who orchestrate the anti-China campaign are doing it to destroy Trump, just as they did with the Russia story. So this Assange, Snowden angle is very, very important to break off this rush to war with China, to expose that it really is part of the coup against Trump.
Okay, Mike, can you hear me? Okay. We have another of our friends already on screen now. His name is Toti Casiño. So I'd like to ask them if they have any questions so far, or Ethos, maybe you might want to ask question.
Hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the recent announcement of Trump with Israel and the UAE, and there's talk that other Middle Eastern nations will also follow suit. This is almost immediately following the bombing of in Beirut. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Is this a positive thing moving forward? Because it seems like Trump has gotten very good feedback or positive reviews for his this feat, as they call it. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think we have to be very careful about our evaluation of what's going on with this process. On the positive side, Trump, as is his character, and in this sense, it's very much like Lyndon LaRouche. He refuses to accept what's handed to him as the necessary policy, the accepted opinions. So what he said from the beginning is that every effort to deal with the Middle East was based on, we have to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to come to peace, and then we can start to solve all these other problems. And he said, it's failed. Why beat a dead horse? Over and over and over again, failed. Therefore, I want to try something new. So as soon as he became president, he went to Saudi Arabia. He brought together all the Arab leaders from all over the world, right? Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as throughout the Middle East, Pakistan. And he said, stop this damn terrorism. He told the Wahhabi Saudi crowd, who everybody knew was financing terrorism, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS. He said, cut out this crap. And to a certain extent they did. And this was soon joined by Putin, right? Who walked into Syria, who stopped at the disaster that we saw in Iraq and Libya. He didn't let it happen in Syria. And people, I think, know Trump was working with Putin on the Syria question. They called it deconfliction, that it was clearly collaboration. Let's not make this another regime change war. Let's stop terrorism, and we'll work together to stop terrorism. Again, that's been sabotaged by some of the generals around Trump. Trump said, let's get out of Syria. The general said, no, sorry. Sorry, Mr. President, Commander-in-Chief. We're not going to let you do that. So then he began pushing this idea of basically an agreement without any talk with the Palestinians at all. And they came out with this agreement in January, I believe it was, which was a horrible idea, basically allowing the Israelis to simply annex all of their settlements in the West Bank and calling what's left a Palestinian state. This was a terrible idea. And what happened just now with the deal with the UAE is that Trump, in talking to the UAE, Mr. Mohammed bin Zayed, said, you must stop that annexation of the Palestinian territory, or there will be no peace with the Gulf states. And Trump said to Bibi Netanyahu, you've got to do this. So there's a positive side, because as you know, Netanyahu said, we're suspending the annexation. But he promised the settlers that he was still going to push ahead with the annexation, but it's suspended for now. So the danger is still there. The negative side is that Netanyahu is a Nazi. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian ever making a real deal, I'm sure you've talked before about what happened in 1993, I believe, the Oslo Accords. This was when actually one of the good things Bill Clinton did. He organized the Palestinians and the Israelis to talk together without the British there. They went to Oslo. They had talks without the British. And they came to an agreement. They said, let's use Israeli technology and the skilled labor of the Palestinians to build water, especially. Very much like what LaRouche had proposed, what he called the Oasis Plan for the Middle East. Address the water. Water is more valuable than oil. You have the water, you can have advanced agriculture and industry. So they made that agreement, and LaRouche's immediate response was, get the tractors rolling. Get the tractors rolling now. Don't let the IMF and the World Bank run this. Get the tractors rolling. Get the Israelis and the Palestinians working together. Then we have a chance for peace. If you get development first, then you can have peace. Don't think that you need to get peace first, and then you'll get development, because you'll never get peace. You need to have the common aims of both sides working together. Now, that didn't happen. And as you know, not only did they let the IMF and the World Bank come in and run it, so the tractors never started running. But within, I think, about 2 years, the crazies in Israel killed Yitzhak Rabin, the man who had broken away from his military past and said, let's have peace based on development. Bam, they killed him. Right? So what do you end up with? You end up with Bibi Netanyahu, whose father was the top British Zionist agent working with Jabotinsky, who's literally a fascist. So you have now in Israel basically a country run by a bunch of British fascists. So is this going to lead to anything good? Maybe. It's possible. I think that Jared Kushner, who's has been working this deal for Trump. What he said was, we wanted to try something new. And he said, Trump is willing to fail, but he wants to try to solve the problem. And I think in his head someplace, he understands that the Middle East is the key example of how the British set up intentionally unsolvable problems. They had the Sykes-Picot Treaty after World War I, where they drew sovereignty lines. They created countries which purposely had Kurds in all of them, or contested areas. And they created the Israel versus Palestine crisis, which is they don't want a resolution. It's a perfect way to make all the nations in the world take sides. Are you for the Israelis or are you for the Palestinians? Take your choice. You have to be for one or the other. Now, I think it's most important in the Middle East to recognize that China works with every one of these countries. It works with Iran, it works with Israel, it works with Saudi Arabia. So you have the Sunni Shia thing, which part of this deal for the UAE is that they're trying to get the Gulf states to work with the anti-Iran people to keep that Shia-Sunni conflict going. So you have all of these divisions created by the empire that they're trying to push to keep the crisis. But I think Trump has in his mind, we can break this British permanent conflict, just like he says we have to end the endless wars, right? We can break this permanent conflict and find a way to bring everybody together. So I think our approach has to be like China, work with everybody. Like Russia. Russia too has good relations with Israel, good relations with the Palestinians, good relations with Iran, good relations with Saudi Arabia, right? There's no reason we can't work with all of them and bring them together. Perhaps Trump is heading in that direction. This is our responsibility to intervene to make sure that we use the Belt and Road idea, because the Chinese are key here. Like I said about Lebanon, it was the fact that they said, we're going to go with the Belt and Road. Boom, explosion, right? And the US passed a thing called the Caesar sanctions. I find that a very appropriate name for Pompeo and Caesar, Caesar Pompeo. But what are the Caesar sanctions? It basically says anybody who does business with Syria, we're going to sanction them. So this was basically telling Lebanon, go to hell, because almost all Syrian trade goes through Lebanon. It was an intentional policy of provoking war and breakdown within Lebanon. So that's a lot of different aspects. This is one of the most complex crises in history, created by the British, and resolving it means breaking the British Empire, bringing the world together, getting Russia and China involved with the US in a resolution that's based on peace through development. Only can you achieve peace through a development policy, what we have always called the Oasis plan that LaRouche called for in the Middle East. So,
But Frank, Mike, just to add to what Itos was saying, the other aspect of this would be the political impact on Trump as being able to put together Israel and an Arab country, a very significant Arab country, and to sit down to sign a peace accord. Somehow, this should benefit him in his politics for the coming November elections.
yeah, I think that's true, but be careful, because the British use what they call the Zionist lobby in the United States to keep people controlled. So some of the Democrats had to come out and say, well, I must say this is a good thing, right? But this is feeding into the idea that we have to be on Israel's side against Palestine and against Iran.
Right. Okay.
And we could have a war in Iran too. Pompeo is crazy about the Iran. Pompeo just stopped 4 ships on the high seas and took their oil. And he said, we have the right to do that because we impose sanctions on Iran. They're not allowed to sell oil. Therefore, we can be pirates. No, we impose sanctions. You can't blame us for stopping private ships on the high seas and stealing their oil. That's our right. Pompeo Caesar, Hail Caesar. You know, this is Pompeo. People are crazy. And they're stopping the oil from going to Venezuela, another case where they're trying to provoke a war. Any of these things could break out into war if Trump doesn't have the power to override the military-industrial complex, which still runs our military policy.
Mike, if I may?
Yes.
Toti to be here.
This is Toti. Hi, good to meet you.
Right, good to meet you too. It's known worldwide that the President of the United States is one of the highly recognized institutions worldwide, and they bring about a huge followers, particularly in foreign policy. Apparently, your current president, Donald Trump, although he may have a strong arm domestically, but in terms of his foreign policy, the question now lies is that they have the proper circle of foreign advisors that would give them more strategic potential with respect to the different arena facing him, be it in the East or Southeast Asia or somewhere in America, unlike his predecessor, where all these politicians, at the time of Clinton, even Carter, for that matter, but then we have here a president that who never even served in the government post the longest time. So now that you're on the next election, it's critical to know that the positioning of the foreign policy for the United States. What is the level of competency, if I may, or capability of Trump in able to address all this overlying issues besides economic policy, particularly more national security or foreign or other global security?
Okay, your voice was breaking up a little bit, so I may not have completely understood everything you said. But I think you addressed Trump being an outsider, not a person who's been in the inside of politics. How can he do a foreign policy? I think that's the advantage. And in terms of his advisors are all from the establishment, which basically means they go along with the British imperial view of the world. The US, since 1971, when the dollar was taken off of gold, and we allowed the British system to take over Wall Street, and that Wall Street increasingly took over Washington. The country is run by the British Empire, which is a financial empire. It's the City of London. It's the banking institutions in Wall Street and London who are the empire. They're the ones who run the military-industrial complex. They're the ones who make money from the international drug trade, from the massive arms sales, and so forth. When you hear the word military-industrial complex that Eisenhower used, that's what he was referring to, was this financial empire that runs this global war machine, the global drug business, the deindustrialization, what's now called the Green New Deal. Now, when Trump came in, his biggest advantage was he said, I don't accept these establishment policies that everybody's supposed to accept, like globalization. I think globalization, he said, is nonsense. We have to return to sovereignty. Not only American sovereignty. When he says America first, remember when he was working with Putin and with Xi Jinping, he would often say, I think America first for America, China first for China, Russia first for Russia, and he even said Mexico first for the Mexicans. And he's actually working very closely now with López Obrador, the new president of Mexico. So he rejected that. He rejected the Paris Accord, this idea that climate change is going to burn up the world. He said, this is nonsense. It's scientifically nonsense, and it basically is a policy to convince us to give up progress, and we're not going to do it. So he breaks these accepted policies that the so-called experienced politicians all accept, and of course the media accepts. Now, on the foreign policy question, when Trump fired John Bolton, what he said was, I liked having John Bolton around. He always gave me his opinions, except that if I had kept him around, we'd probably be in World War VI by now, because he never saw a war he didn't like. So I had to fire him. Now, why in the hell hasn't he fired Pompeo? Because Pompeo is just as crazy as John Bolton. Well, he thinks he needs to win the election and doesn't want to shake up the vote. He wants to be able to say, I've been the toughest against Russia, I'm the toughest against China. Why? He didn't say that during the first 2 years of his administration. I mean, he was forced into these crazy things against Russia, but he was personally talking to Putin all the time. And the reason Syria was not destroyed, it's still in great danger, but the reason it was not destroyed like Libya and Iraq was because Trump worked with Putin personally. The reason we began to have a new trade deal and new peaceful arrangements with China was because of Trump's personal work with Xi Jinping. So he's not one of the established, experienced foreign policy people, but he's an outsider who recognized that this so-called establishment was rotten to the core, that the accepted opinions of neoliberal society, legalized drugs, deindustrialization, globalization, climate change, all of legalized drugs. These things are sick, they're crazy, and we have to restore what he called correctly the American system. And he talked about Alexander Hamilton for a while, and then he didn't, because he knows he has nobody around him who thinks like he does. The only people who understand how Trump is trying to be is the Lyndon LaRouche organization. And we have a few friends in high places in the United States, but by and large, we have very, very good friends around the world. And if you've watched our conferences, you see we have leading spokesmen from Russia, from China, from Africa, from South America, leading people. But very few in America, because people here have been brainwashed or frightened into going along with this establishment ideology. Now, like I said at the beginning, everybody knows this is the greatest crisis of mankind in history, or at least since the World War. So it's possible to get people to break out of this sort of brainwashed environment where they have to accept these established ways. And it's that makes us say we must get Trump reelected. We must get this diplomacy, personal diplomacy, between Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping now, in the month of September, during the UN time. We're fighting to get that so-called P5 meeting now, so we don't have a war before the November election. You may have heard that Russia and China and even people like Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister in Australia, have been publicly warning that we could see a war with China, a hot war, not a cold war, before the November election, because the British will do anything to try to force this issue, and they think they can force the Russians and the Chinese to back down, but they're willing to risk a war, nuclear war. This is how dangerous the situation is. So we want to get Trump reelected. We must. I mean, I think you know what's happened to the Democrat Party in the United States is that it's now totally part of the insurrection. They're this woman, Kamala Harris, that was just chosen as the vice president candidate. She was the first person to support the Green New Deal, totally supports the insurrection on the streets. They talk about Black Lives Matter. Don't be fooled by that. Black Lives Matter is just a phrase they put out there to make people think that they had to support this insurrection or they were racist. Right? It's just, this is funded by George Soros, by the National Endowment for Democracy, the same people that run coups all over the world.
Mike,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a three scenario, but I'm praying for the first and second scenario will not happen. The first scenario is we all know that the destabilization is in high gear right now. The destabilization plan for Donald Trump inside and outside America. My number one question is if President Trump will be assassinated before November election, and what if Trump loses the November election? That's the second question. And the third is what if Trump wins the election? So that's three scenarios. Of course, the first and the second we don't like that to happen. So, in your opinion, what will be the scenario in the first case of what if he will be assassinated?
Well, this is obviously a great danger. There's no question.
Yeah.
He knows it.
Yeah.
And he has not depended on the so-called normal security operations. I mean,
Yeah.
he obviously has the Secret Service and so forth, but he has other means of defending himself. Mr. LaRouche was threatened with assassination many, many times, including when he was thrown in prison. And what he always said was that the only way you can stop an assassination is through what he calls factitious advantage, which means you identify precisely who it is that wants you killed, right? So that, for instance, when Kennedy was killed by a lone assassin, right, it obviously was not a lone assassin. It was the British who wanted to go to war in Vietnam, and Kennedy wouldn't do it, who wanted to go to the British financial system, Kennedy wouldn't do it. So they killed him. And we've documented how that British-run assassination through Canada and New Orleans was run. He himself would always say, I know who wants to kill me. I know it's the empire, it's the people around Henry Kissinger. And here's how and why they want me dead. And people would say, oh, you're paranoid, you think you're so important, somebody wants to kill you. He said, you don't worry about that. You make it impossible for them to deploy some so-called lone assassin. So Trump has not had any problem in identifying his enemies, right? I mean, never has there been a president who goes after the fake news, the crazy opponents, sleepy Joe Biden, I mean, he has names for all his enemies. He names them. So this is the best way not to be assassinated. Name your real enemies from the beginning. What happens if he loses the election? I pray that will not happen. I cry for the future of mankind. If we have the Obama, Clinton people back, there will be wars. It'll be a disaster. I mean, what's happening? I suppose you see this in the Philippines, but internally, when you look and see that this Democrat Party has put up as their presidential candidate a person who everybody knows is in the early stages of dementia. It is very sad. It's sad. I mean, not only is Biden now senile, but he's been publicly exposed as a criminal for what he did in Ukraine. And keep in mind that this coup in Ukraine in 2014 is very important. That was run by Barack Obama, and he appointed Joe Biden to be the person to oversee the coup, along with a few others in the State Department. And then, as you know, Biden went over there. He did what Trump was accused of doing. He said, either you fire this attorney general who's going after the company my son works for, or I'm going to take $1 billion. I mean, this is a crime. So he's caught in multiple crimes, and he's senile, and they're running this guy for president with a vice president candidate who is a total fanatic in terms of supporting the insurrection, supporting drugs, support her father, who is from Jamaica. Kamala Harris's father was a Jamaican professor teaching in the U.S. and Stanford. But when she came out supporting the legalization of drugs, he went public and said, I'm ashamed of what my daughter was doing. Anybody who thinks, and she even said, I'm from Jamaica, or my father's from Jamaica, and they have legal drugs there. He said, anybody who agrees with this portrayal of all Jamaicans as hothead wackos, this is disgusting, he said. So this is what the Democratic Party has become. Their convention begins tomorrow. Their convention goes from Monday to Thursday. It's going to be Bill Clinton, it's going to be Obama, it's going to be Pelosi, all of these people who have destroyed the country, and they think they can win with a senile president. So you get a sense of how extreme the situation has become in the United States. So, in answer to your question, we are doing everything we possibly can to make sure Trump does win, not by just supporting Trump, but by telling Trump and his base that he's in grave danger because he's fallen into this trap against China. That he has to use his personal diplomacy to break away from the Congress and from the cabinet and from the military people who have restrained him and prevented him from doing what he wanted to do. So that's our task. That's what the LaRouche movement is doing. And it's not just Americans who have to do that. It's people in all nations, all institutions. In fact, I call on you personally and your institutions. Publicly support this call for the P5 meeting. Call for Russia, China, India, United States, not India at this point, because it's P5. Call for this meeting publicly. Get a resounding call from around the world. Get these world leaders together, stop this threat of war, deal with this pandemic with an emergency health program for Africa, South America. These are the things that everybody has a responsibility and can have an effect because of the severity of this global crisis.
Thank you, Mike.
You didn't? No, I was going to add that there's a third scenario about his winning. What do you see about his winning? But yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow.
No, the third scenario that RJ mentioned was that if Trump wins, what can we expect in the near future?
Well, what we would try to make happen would be for him to get a whole new cabinet. Flynn, by that time, could probably be brought back in to replace Pompeo, assuming that we succeed in getting Flynn completely free from this. And Flynn is not, he is also rapidly anti-Iran, and I think also anti-China. But, as you know, Flynn publicly identified the fact that Obama was purposely supporting Al-Qaeda in order to overthrow Gaddafi, openly supporting the terrorists in order to get regime change. So he has the courage to go after the criminals, which means people like Brennan and Clapper and so forth. And it's possible that he could clean out some of the problem people and bring in people who are at least close to us. I think you know the Roger Stone story. Have you discussed the Roger Stone story?
Yes.
On your show? No, people should know Roger Stone considers Lyndon LaRouche to be probably the greatest genius says so publicly. He met LaRouche back in 1980. He recently, having been not pardoned by Trump, but his sentence was commuted. The reason he didn't pardon him is because he thinks he can actually get a retrial and get it clean so that he doesn't have that hanging over his head. But Stone immediately came onto a LaRouche meeting. He publicly wanted to identify himself with the LaRouche movement. And he said what happened to him, Stone, and the others who were prosecuted by Robert Miller was what happened to Lyndon LaRouche. And he said, I met LaRouche in 1980 in the election, the Ronald Reagan election, and it was Lyndon LaRouche who helped Reagan get the nomination by exposing the evil of George Bush. And George Bush is vindictive, and he said Bush would never let that go. And he said the Bushes and Bush CIA chief and things like that, as well as president, was in fact a key player in getting the operation to put Mr. LaRouche and himself and others in prison, right? And that the operation was run by a fellow by the name of Miller, Robert Miller, the same Miller who was assigned to get Donald Trump in the special prosecution case for basically the same reason, because LaRouche had been the person who organized Ronald Reagan to work with Russia to develop a strategic defense initiative against nuclear weapons. And so instead of having mutual assured destruction, the British came, which Kissinger supported, where we can blow each other up. And that supposedly is a good thing because we won't go to war. But it means that you can have colonial wars without the worry that it's going to escalate into a nuclear war. And it keeps the world divided. So LaRouche said, no, let's work together with the Russian scientists, the American scientists, develop a way of stopping nuclear war, of making nuclear weapons obsolete. And Reagan adopted that program. And that's the point at which Kissinger and others said, Reagan's got to go. And they ran operations against Ronald Reagan, as well as launching these criminal cases against us based on nothing, basically, just accusing us of crimes and then throwing us in prison. So I think once he gets elected, the crisis is not over. That's for sure. We have to make the new paradigm work, where great nations on earth come together, sit down, begin to deal with the creation of a true renaissance, a world in which great nations recognize that there are common aims for mankind, that there are things which divide us culturally, politically, and so forth, but we're all human beings, that we all have a stake in the future of mankind. We're all mortal, we're all going to die, but the human race doesn't have to die, and mankind doesn't have to die. If we recognize that working together, for instance, we can begin to colonize the moon, and colonize Mars, and move on to other galaxies, and find other places for mankind to live. Because, the Earth is not going to last forever. It may not last for more than a couple of billion years. And we've got responsibilities for making sure that we're able to sustain humanity in the universe, whether the Earth survives or not. So these are issues that, this is not daydreaming, fancy future talk. This is reality, because it's true in the relative short term as well as in the long term. And believe me, we have in our hands, possibly for the first time, the ability to end geopolitics and empire forever. That's possible. It's not going to happen just by getting Trump here. But without that, it's going to be very, very difficult, and we're probably going to be at war. And Trump himself, he said just the other day, he said if Hillary Clinton had been elected, we would have been at war with North Korea a long time ago, and we'd possibly be in the world. And it's true. And it's just as true if somehow Trump gets defeated in November.
Yeah, Toti?
Yeah, we would consider this a global pandemic not limited to the world war, but also organization subjected to the some kind of rules by the World Health Organization, probably the dominated both countries. And the alliance of Trump, Putin, and the regime is like the alliance that Frank did in World War II, wherein they allied with Stalin and Churchill. And whatever the outcome of their meeting, especially if you refer back to the history of World War II, that created the beginning of the United Nations and Bretton Woods agreement. Would there be some kind of outcome of this sort by the time that we get over this crisis with the three major leaders in the world, Putin, Trump, and Xi come up with some kind of new model for the next decade or so, for this present decade?
Well, that's what we're fighting to make happen. Yeah. We don't think it can happen without their coming together. In other words, the U.S. can't solve even its own problems within the U.S. by itself. And the same is true for every situation around the world. The only way we're going to end this multi-pronged crisis, the pandemic, the financial blowout, the economic breakdown crisis, the danger of war, the starvation, we could only resolve this globally. And I agree with you 100%. What made it possible for us to defeat fascism and Japanese imperialism was the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, we're going to work with Russia. And it's a good thing to work with Russia, with the USSR at that time, the Soviet Union. And we're going to work with China. In fact, he tried to work with both the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, and with the communists. He sent OSS people up to work with Mao and the communists at Yan'an. At the same time that he was working with Chiang Kai-shek, he tried to get them to collaborate, and he did to some extent. Actually, Chiang Kai-shek and Zhou Enlai tended to work together during the war, and even somewhat after. But it was exactly that alliance with which Roosevelt could go to Churchill and say, Winston, this is in Roosevelt's son's book as he saw it about his father. He worked with his father. And he says, when he saw Winston Churchill, he said, Winston, we're not fighting this war to save the damn British Empire. And Winston Churchill turned red and said, over my dead body. And Churchill said, Winston, we're going to use American system methods, not 18th century colonial methods, to build those countries that you kept enslaved, you and the French, Dutch, Portuguese. And he saw those countries. When he went to the meetings at Tehran and all that stuff, he stopped in the African countries and was horrified by the fact that these countries looked the same as they did 200 years ago before they were taken over colonial. And he said, we're going to use the same methods that I used during the 1930s to build up this mass infrastructure across America. It's infrastructure that is the key. We're going to build these countries with American system methods. Well, you know, he died too soon in April of 45, before the end of the war. And a very, very evil, small man named Truman. There's a long story of why he was vice president instead of Henry Wallace, who was a great man. But Truman then immediately accepted the British demand to drop nuclear bombs on a country that was already defeated for no purpose than to show the rest of the world that we were crazy and that they better do what we tell them and they better accept one world government or we'll bomb you too. That was the only reason for the mass slaughter of innocent people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That was the evil. Already, the British Empire was beginning to take over the United States the moment Roosevelt died. So these are the kinds of things that we have to fight for, and we have to make sure we actually end the power of the empire. if we're going to succeed in building a true new renaissance for mankind as a whole.
Are there any other questions?
5 minutes.
Okay, I just wanted to add on to this last one. Just recently, since everybody was supposedly waiting for a vaccine, and everybody seemed, all leaders, including our own here, has been well, preconditioned to thinking that the moment the vaccine appears, this will save all of our problems. And all of a sudden, it's very much like Putin. He pulls out something from his hat, a rabbit from his hat, and he says, "We have a vaccine, and we're offering it to the world." And as a matter of fact, here in the Philippines, there was an official offer by through Ambassador Igor Gorbachev to our government for the president to for the country, and the president immediately responded, and he says he likes Russia. He trusts the scientists of Russia, and believes in the sincerity of Putin, and he offered himself to be the first volunteer for the vaccine that's coming out of Russia. But as expected, immediately, uh, our Department of Health somehow brings out a list of 6 or 7 different vaccines that are already in the works, supposed to be available to the Philippines. But before this, there was no talk of such 6 or 7 offers, right? And it gives us the wonder how come the statements being made by our Department of Health Secretary seems to coincide with other agencies in the United States who are, many believe, are part of a deep state operation. What do you say to that, Mike?
Well, let me take it from a higher perspective.
Okay.
It's certainly the case that when the Russians announced this, there was massive anti-Russia hysteria saying, "Oh, they can't use this. It hasn't been proven safe yet. They're just beginning phase 3. They're threatening people's lives by using this." Well, all of that was nonsense. In fact, what's happened with the research on this vaccine is one excellent example of what can happen when nations do work together. The emergency program that Trump announced here in the U.S. worked speed, he called it, which was as fast as possible. We have to get to a vaccine. It's not an America First thing. Actually, our medical teams, both private and public, are working very closely with people around the world. There's a long article by Dr. Ned Brzezinski, EIR, that just came out, the Executive Intelligence, on the fact that there's a true medical revolution taking place in the world. That in fact, all kinds of new ideas are being used for vaccines, not just let's put a little bit of the disease in somebody and that works up the antibodies, but ideas that use protein that are actually not part of the virus itself, but which activate the antibodies within the system. All kinds of new ideas and tremendous level of cooperation around the world. So there's a lot of this media hype against Russia. But it's true, actually, what your health department said. There are other vaccines that should be ready very soon because Russia's not the only ones. And in fact, I'll tell you something that people don't know, which was very interesting. The head of our CDC, Redfield, gave an interview a few days ago in which he said everybody's complaining about Russia where they're only beginning phase 3, but they're already giving the vaccine to people who are vulnerable, like people with heart disease or obese or diabetic, and frontline workers, doctors and nurses. and the newspapers are saying, oh, this is terrible. We're doing the same thing, Redfield said. We also have vaccines that are now going into phase 3, meaning that they've been proved basically safe in phase 2. And in phase 3, in which you're trying to determine the efficacy, whether it works well or not. And you have people who get the treatment and then people who get placebos. That's phase 3. But we also, like the Russians, since we know it's safe, we are giving this vaccine, different types, to people on the front line and people who are vulnerable, just like the Russians are. We know it's safe, it may not work, but it's worth doing because this is such an extremely deadly and serious crisis. So I wouldn't worry about that. I praise Duterte for making the offer that he's going to take it. And we're delighted to see that the Russians are going ahead with this vaccine. But the Russians are not saying our vaccine over your vaccine. They also, the medical teams there, are very much working with and encouraging the work on other kinds of vaccines in the US, in China, and around the world. So this is an example of what can be done if we bring the world together. And we don't want to let this who gets it first mentality spoil what in fact is good cooperation by scientists and medical professionals around the world. And God knows we need it. This, you know, when this thing, that's important, but as we've said before, together to get the same begins to you're going to have vaccines that are important that the doctor will cause of the virus coming. So I would say let's get the world together and we can solve this.
Right. Okay, Mike, we've had you for about more than an hour and a half, and we are so delighted to have you here, especially on this Zoom facility. And I suppose and expect that we will be in touch with each other more often because it's now much easier in this way to be able to get this through. So, so
Thank
maybe
you very much. I appreciate it. Ethos, I'm looking forward to your class on Franklin Roosevelt.
Soon.
Good.
famous
And
last
very good to
words.
meet you, RJ and Toti.
Yes.
All the others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much. On behalf of KDP, thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Sige. Okay. Meron po tayo siguro mga messages na dumating. Meron gusto magpatanong ng mga ibang bagay. Hindi po natin na bigyan ng pagkakataon matanong. Sabi po ni Glenn Buwan, can you ask Mr. Billington if he has any idea of the U.S. intention against Chinese proposal to develop Fuga group of islands just north of Cagayan? Hindi ko po naitanong yan kasi as of now it's all allegations versus other allegations, no? Hindi pa po natin na sinusiguro at ang ating pong gobyerno ay hindi pa nagbibigay ng ganitong klaseng reaction coming from our Department of Foreign Affairs or even from Malacanang. Kaya hindi po natin naitanong yan. Besides, Mike Billington will not be in a position right away, no, to answer that. Glenn Buwan again, what is the opinion of Mr. Billington regarding the transfer of U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem? Also, the continued embargo against Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and other countries. No? Well, again, we were not able to ask him that. Maybe next time, no? Glenn. Isai Ariel, good evening, Father and Son. Thank you always for keeping us informed. Thank you. Esteban Pagtakahan, good evening, Sir Butch and Itos Valdes. Freddy Oredina, Nesara, passing wheel starts 8:17, connected to 9/11 tragedy for brother Mike Billington. Ano ba yung Nesara? Passing wheel, would you know? Okay. Isay Ariel, sigurado meron na naman si George Soros sa ongoing destabilization sa ilang bansa ngayon. Sigurado yan, Isay. Actually, it was in one of my questions, pero I felt that it was so obvious that George Soros will be involved in this deep state thing at dito sa mga regime change efforts at mga kaguluhan, pati na yan sa mga Beirut, sa Belarus, no? Yung pong Beirut, napakabigat po ng sinabi ni Mike Billington sa atin dyan. Bago po na bomba ang Lebanon, sa Beirut, Lebanon, bago po nagkaroon ng putok dyan, ito pong si Pompeo, sinasabi niya na pinipilit niya ang gobyerno ng Lebanon na tanggalin yung mga Hezbollah sa Lebanon. Kasi ngayon, sa bansang Lebanon, meron pong parang coalition government. Yung mga Kristiyano, tsaka yung mga Hezbollah, no? Hezbollah is Muslim, di ba? Ay magkasama po sa pagpapalakad sa kanilang bansa ng Lebanon. Ito naman si Pompeo, Secretary of State ng bansang Amerika. Dinuduro sila na kinakailangan tanggalin ang mga Hezbollah kung minority lang naman daw sila. Now, ang sinabi po ng gobyerno kasama ng Hezbollah at saka ng Kristiyano, we're not going to do that. No? We're going to go to China to ask China to help us in our infrastructure. No? Hindi po nagtagal, may malaking sumabog sa Lebanon. Ang implication dyan, ang gumawa na naman dyan, ang CIA, no? Pero iniimbestiga pa rin po hanggang ngayon. No? Romel Tuazon, good evening mga sir. Adriano Flores, good morning, Butch and San. Tiga saan ba si Adriano Flores? Baka sa Amerika, no? Ernesto Espares Jr. Good evening, Sir Butch and Sir Itos. Para sa akin, alisin ang lockdown dahil wala ring epekto, mapigilan ng COVID. Nagsisilbi lamang balakid upang makalaban ang tao sa pagkagutom. Nakatali paat kamay ng tao sa bahay dahil sa lockdown. Ang pagkakasakit at pagkamatay ay normal sa sagot mundo. Ang hindi normal ay pag hindi nagkasakit at hindi mamatay ang tao. Kalokohan niyang lockdown. Pagsuot lang ng face mask, okay na yan. Diyan sila maghigpit dahil sa pesting COVID na nasa hangin na di nakikita at walang silbi ang barye. PPE na nga at helmet sapat na. Okay, thank you. Marami pong sasang-ayon sa sinasabi ninyo. Marisa Camba, Trump suffers like Duterte pala. Hindi binabalita ang nagagawa niya. That's right. At least now, somehow, you're able to understand what's going on. And maybe you can check it out. Instead of just relying on mainstream media, you should do a little bit more research. Cesar Soberano, Millie Weaver, conservative American journalist, arrested and jailed in August 14, 2020 in Ohio for Shadow Gate, a documentary exposing the deep state and shadow government pervading in American empire. 1.1 million times viewed in just a day in YouTube. watch before it's taken down by the 0.01's world's richest neocons, plutocrats, and the military, industrial, financial complex that ruled the American empire. The implications are grave and serious for the entire humanity. Will she follow the steps of Snowden, Assange, and other heroic whistleblowers who suffer miserable lives from the punishment of the powers that be? Nakuha mo ba yung ano? Balik mo nga. I will repeat it. Ito pong isang conservative journalist. Nandyan po siya sa YouTube. Nandyan po yung kanyang link. Si Millie Weaver. Millieweaver. Millie Weaver. Check nyo lang po sa YouTube. No? Meron po siyang pahayag dyan dahil sa libro niyang Shadowgate. No? Isa pong maganda daw libro na exposition ng Deep State. Okay, Adriano Flores, good Sunday evening, Butch at Butch. Okay. Adriano Flores, magandang talakayan sa programa niyo, Butch. Flores, magandang talakayan sa programa niyo. Rod Voigt Pariabras, magandang gabi sa Katipunan, Sir Butch at Sir Itos. Naglabasan agad ang mga puppets ng European Pharma, ng mga doctors organization dito sa Pilipinas, ng ibalita ni Presidente Duterte na bibigyan ng Pilipinas ng vaccine ng Russia. From Subic, Zambales, watching you. Thank you. Ron Bintulan, hello, Consi, Itos, Valdes. Freddy Oredina, Israel is a gift trophy given to Zionists per Balfour Declaration, signed by Churchill in winning World War I and World War II. Ofelia Lasso Achuela, watching here, California, USA. Okay, hanggang dyan na lang po tayo. Maraming po salamat at na sinamahan nyo kami ngayon, this evening. I hope we were able to understand and pick up much of what was being discussed coming from our good friend, Mr. Mike Billington of the LaRouche International Movement. No? At madalas po natin siyang nakakausap at sana po, if you want to check out some of the things that we're talking about sa LaRouche organization, go to larouchepac.com. That's LaRouchePAC.com. larouchepac.com. Hanggang sa muli po, next week on Sunday, ang ating pong katipunan, ang ating pong kasama dito.
Itos Valdes po. Good evening po sa lahat.
At
si Roxanne, ang ating tech.
Roxanne, ang
Roxanne Cruz.
technical expert natin, Butch Valdes po. Magandang gabi po sa inyo. Salamat po.